This will be part 5 of the Neurolocalization lecture series where we will cover proprioception, which is knowing where the limbs are at in space. Proprioception is one of our most fascinating senses, as it can be the middle of the night, and you could make your way to your bed just by feeling your way around. Or if you are digging in your book bag, you could find your keys, even isolating which key is your house key, just by feeling it. In animals, we do not have as many options for testing proprioception as in people, and some are more helpful than others. But this is a fairly complete list of the different ways we can assess proprioception in animals. We will not cover this entire list in great detail, but rather some of the more important ones. We will start with paw placement. This is where we flip the paw over, or knuckle it over, and see how quickly the animal replaces it. Notice that the examiner is supporting the animal's weight while it is being performed, so their weight does not shift, causing the animal to lose balance, assessing the vestibular system rather than proprioception. As you can see in this video, the paw placement on the right is absent and severely delayed to absent on the left. The pathway for paw placement is one of the most fascinating pathways in existence. It starts at the tip of the toe and makes its way up the limb, through the spinal nerve and nerve root, and through the white matter of the spinal cord to the medulla within the caudal aspect of the brainstem. This means one single nerve extends this entire distance. In other words, one single cell could be over a meter long, especially when we think about some of the larger animals like a horse. After the synapse within the medulla, the pathway goes to, or through the thalamus, and decussates to make its way to the forebrain. Some comments on paw placement. Minimal strength is required for an animal to perform paw placement, especially if you are performing it correctly and supporting the animal's weight. I generally recommend standing behind the patient to perform paw placement, as it will make things easier on you and the patient. Something else to keep in mind is because paw placement largely bypasses the cerebellum, a pure cerebellar lesion will not cause a paw placement deficit, at least as a general rule. However, forebrain lesions can cause paw placement deficits, and why sometimes paw placement is referred to as conscious proprioception. Finally, because of the pathway for paw placement, both brainstem and spinal cord lesions would likely cause paw placement deficits. Because the pathway for paw placement is heavily myelinated, just imagine if you are walking in the dark and trip, you need that information to be perceived quickly so you don't fall, and the axon is so long, proprioception is often the first abnormality seen with a myelopathy. Next, we will discuss hopping. Hopping is a little more difficult to perform, especially if the animal is weak, as it requires more strength to hop. To perform hopping, you want to lift one of the limbs and push the animal laterally in the opposite direction of the limb that is lifted, as shown here in this video. Notice that the examiner is not lifting the animal so much that their feet are coming off the ground, but rather just lifts the limb and pushes the animal sideways, using the thoracic limbs as a pivot point. The pathway for hopping is different compared to paw placement. It starts out similar, at the tip of the toe, then up the leg through the nerve, spinal nerves, and dorsal nerve root. However, within the spinal cord, the pathway for hopping will synapse. This could be right at the level of the intumescence as shown in this animation, or even more cranial. This second neuron's axon will then traverse through the white matter of the spinal cord, through the medulla, and up to the cerebellum. So another difference of the hopping pathway is that it will go to the cerebellum. From there, axons are projected rostrally to the thalamus, and ultimately to the forebrain. The cortical input from the hopping pathway is less compared to paw placement, but there is still cortical influence over hopping. And as discussed earlier, hopping requires more strength. Understanding the differences between hopping and paw placement is helpful with understanding deficits and lesion localization. For instance, forebrain lesions can often have mildly delayed hopping, but paw placement could be completely absent. Cerebellar lesions can have normal placement because this pathway largely bypasses the cerebellum. However, hopping can be severely delayed to absent with a cerebellar lesion. And, as stated previously with brainstem and spinal cord lesions, both paw placement and hopping are often affected because the pathways traverse through both of these regions. However, the degree of the deficit might be different because the tracks for these pathways are different, which is something we will get back to shortly. Similar to the forebrain, proprioception is graded from 0 to 2, with 0 being absent, 1 being delayed, and 2 being normal. This video is to just replay the technique of paw placement and hopping. Notice the subtleties such as the weight being supported with paw placement and not supporting too much weight with hopping. Here is an example of how paw placement might be worse on one side compared to hopping, but notice how it is the opposite on the other side. Don't get confused when you appreciate these differences because the nuances discussed earlier are just general rules. This animal does not have a left forebrain lesion and a left cerebellar lesion. Rather, this patient has a thoracolumbar myelopathy and just happens to have different tracts affected in different ways. We can be confident in this when we look at the thoracic limbs. Notice how normal paw placement and hopping are in the thoracic limbs, which would not be the case with an intracranial lesion. Again, just like with the pelvic limbs, for paw placement you need to support some of the weight, and with hopping be certain not to support too much of the weight. Another commonly performed proprioceptive test is wheelbarrowing, where we will lift the pelvic limbs off of the ground, either by the abdomen or hips, and move them forward, just like a wheelbarrow race from when you were a kid. The pathway for wheelbarrowing is similar to that of hopping, but requires even more strength. Hopefully you can appreciate the short strided gait in the thoracic limbs, and eventually you will notice that the animal fatigues and collapses in the thoracic limbs. This is actually a dog with myasthenia gravis. Wheelbarrowing is commonly performed if we do not find any deficits in hopping or paw placement, and the animal allows for it. Again, the pathway is similar to that of hopping, but it is worth noting that we will often perform wheelbarrowing with the head up, then the head down. This is because animals and people can compensate proprioceptive deficits with vision. Therefore, we compare how well they perform wheelbarrowing with the head up versus down. If they perform better when the head is up, it is more likely a strength issue versus a proprioceptive issue, such as in the previous video. If, however, they perform better with the head down compared to the head up, it is more of a proprioceptive issue versus a strength issue. If it is equally bad in both, most often there is a cervical spinal cord issue, but again, this is a general rule. Extensor postural thrust is similar to wheelbarrowing, but is in the pelvic limbs. A big difference, however, between wheelbarrowing and extensor postural thrust is that an animal needs to be lifted off of the surface. Then once their feet touch the ground, they begin to move backwards. This is why we only perform it in smaller animals, and the pathway is similar to that of hopping. This is me performing different types of proprioception on a cat. I find hopping, wheelbarrowing, and extensor postural thrust more reliable in cats compared to paw placement, which you will see why shortly. Notice how normal hopping appears in the thoracic limbs. However, in the pelvic limbs we notice that hopping is markedly decreased to absent in both limbs. We can confirm that this is a real deficit and not just a cat being a cat by repeating the findings with wheelbarrowing in the thoracic limbs, which again is normal, and extensor postural thrust in the pelvic limbs, which again is very abnormal, with the left being worse than the right. Now when we try to perform paw placement, there is a struggle to reveal a deficit, but with enough perseverance, we are able to reveal one. This is because this cat does not like their feet being touched, and not because of a cerebellar lesion. We know this because of how normal the thoracic limbs are. Again, we can eventually see the paw placement is severely delayed to absent in the pelvic limbs, but it was much easier to appreciate the other deficits, which is why I prefer them in cats, and usually save paw placement for last. Hemi-walking we generally do not perform, especially in larger animals, as we could harm the patient or ourselves if the animal falls. There is a lot of overlap between hemi-walking with paw placement and hopping, so it assesses both pathways. Some neurologists feel this is a great way to look for subtle deficits when a forebrain lesion is present. However, I have not had this experience. That said, if I am expecting to find a deficit and do not, I will perform hemi-walking to be thorough. The final test is the table test. This is another test we generally do not perform as it is not the most reliable. The table test is when we cover the animal's eyes and move them towards the table to see if they will lift their limbs onto the table. This can only be done with smaller animals as well. If you are concerned about vision in the patient, the table test could also be performed with the eyes uncovered, as the animal should lift their limbs prior to touching the table. However, I do not find this test reliable in that there are plenty of animals which are normal that fail the table test, just because it is awkward for them, and they might not understand what we are wanting them to do. That is the end of Lecture 5. From Vet Neuro Jar, keep those minds inspired, hearts light, and tails wagging.